All right, so let's go ahead and get started then. My name is Brian Alderman. We're going to be talking about SQL Server and SharePoint. So part of this course, or this session, I use quite a bit for optimizing SQL for SharePoint. And then the other piece I've added in for specifically for this conference is kind of trying to lean you towards working with SQL 2014. And I sat a couple Bill Bear sessions this week, so I actually threw in a couple things about SharePoint 2016 in here. I couldn't reach him to say if it's okay, but if he's already talked about it, I'm just going to repeat what he's saying and try to stay within there. I'm an MCSE SharePoint certification. I'm an MCT for my 20th year. Author of a couple books, as you can see towards the bottom of the slide here. And I'm going to give away a signed copy of one of the SharePoint 2013 book in this session here. I'm not quite sure how yet, but we're going to find a way to do that. And I speak at conferences all around the world. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Evolutions Conference in London. I've spoken over in Maine and in Italy, and I love to speak. I love to travel. So it's in the bottom here. I work for a company called CBT Nuggets. We do on-demand video training, not just in Microsoft, but all VMware, PMP, CompTIA, Cisco. We've got a library of over, I don't remember how many hours of courses that we have, but we have a ton of courses. And if you're not familiar with them, I suggest you check us out, and you can get a free 7-day trial to go out and kind of get a flavor for what we do. I've built if you're looking for your MCSE SharePoint, there's a 331 and 332 course, which gives you your SharePoint knowledge, and there's an Office 365, which is the 346 and 347 exam that I've done. That'll allow you to, if you take those 4 exams, you get the MCSE SharePoint. I'm also going to be giving away, I think I am, two 60-day passes to CBT Nuggets for all the Microsoft content you can eat for 60 days. So we're going to give away that as well in this session. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, if you want to reach me later on, my email address is brian.alderman@cbtnuggets.com. My Twitter handle is Brian Alderman, and the CBT Nuggets Twitter handle is CBT Nuggets. I have my own company that I do some authoring and side work and consulting on my spare time, and that's microtechpoint.com. And out there, I have a blog out there, and it's just when you hit that page, you'll see a schedule of my upcoming speaking events. You'll see some pictures from my previous events, and you'll also see, more importantly, there's a Brian's blog there. There's a couple articles I'm going to talk about in this session, so I wanted to make sure that you are familiar with that and know where to find those guys. So just a little bit more about me. I grew up in Vermont. That's a state in the northeast part of the country. Everybody know that? I do have to ask because I got into a cab in California, and I told him I was from Vermont, and he asked me what state that was in. So now I make sure everyone knows that is actually a state. Then I moved to Colorado, spent some time in Colorado Springs, and then I ended up in Arizona. When I was in Vermont, this is Mom, Dad, and I, when I was younger. So Mulletville, actually a little town just outside of Burlington, if you're familiar with Vermont. It's actually called Milton. And notice the hair I had back then. You can't see it up here, but notice here, that's because that was before I met SharePoint. So if you're just getting into SharePoint, you got to be careful because this is what you got to look forward to up here. So just be careful about that. And then I moved to Arizona. I love to play golf. I'm horrible at it. But they have that other cart that drives around and serves you drinks. So that's my favorite cart. And in Arizona, they've made the game, it's a lot of retirees out there. So they made the game a little easier out there, as you can see with the size of this cup here. I like the fact the guy on the left is not taking any chances. He's lining that up. So obviously he's seen that cart a few too many times that goes around and serves the bevies. So we're going to talk about SQL Server, we're going to talk about SharePoint, and we're going to talk about the 19th hole, which is my favorite hole as well, but because that cup is just as large. So we're going to go ahead and, there we go. We're going to talk about SQL Server and SharePoint, the integration. Why am I concerned about SQL Server, specifically with SharePoint? So we're going to talk about the integration process. Then we're also going to talk about some SQL Server configurations that have a huge impact on your SharePoint installation or configuration. So we're going to walk through and talk about those guys. I'm going to demo some of those configurations, some of the changes that you should make to make sure that SQL is optimized for SharePoint. And then we're going to talk about some items specific to SQL Server 24 for SharePoint 2013. I'm going to throw, like I said, I'm going to throw a little bit threw a slide in just like a half hour ago about some changes to SharePoint 2016 which affect your databases. So we're going to talk about those in case you haven't seen Bill Bear sessions on those. And then we'll look at the infamous avoiding ginormous transaction log. How many people have seen it where your transaction log for your SharePoint databases are huge? Okay, we're going to talk about how that happens and how to avoid that. And simple recovery model is not going to be the solution that I'm going to propose for you, even though if you search online, that's what it'll say. Then we're going to wrap it up with some best practices. I'm on a timer, so I can only talk for so long, so you guys will be fortunate enough that they'll shut me down. In fact, they were so worried about me, the guy in the back will shut my microphone off. So once that timer cuts down, they're just going to shut me down. So we'll talk about that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about SharePoint and SQL Server. And I've got some giveaways. I've got some CBT Nugget earbuds. I have, like I said, I got 2 subscriptions to Microsoft training at CBT Nuggets. I've got some hats I'm going to give away here. We'll just do like that type of thing. Good catch, dude. Or actually, good throw. I mean, I'll take the credit for that. So we're going to be giving stuff away. So CBT Nuggets is watch, learn, and conquer. So I'm going to spin it up a little bit to watch, learn, and win for this session today, so we can win some stuff as we're going through this. So why am I concerned about SQL Server and SharePoint? Well, about 89% of all the content you store in SharePoint is stored in SQL Server. So that's why we have such a concern. But remember, about 79.6% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So be careful about that number. But there's a lot of content in there. Now, the title of this is the idea of now better than ever. So the reason they're saying that is because what I'm going to do is try to lean you towards getting to SQL Server 2014, and I'm going to give you reasons why that you want to do that as we go through the session. But when we go into the optimization and configuration settings, all the configuration settings I'm going to make inside of SQL Server are going to be applicable. It doesn't matter if you're running, SharePoint 2007 with SQL 2005. These configuration settings will still be applicable. If you're running SharePoint 2013 with SQL 2012, which is the information or configuration that I have, these will be applicable. SharePoint 26, or I won't speak to 2016 yet, but so we'll leave that one alone. So it's applicable to no matter what mix and mash of SQL and SharePoint that you have. We talked about the majority of data stored in there, including our config database that's in there. The central admin contents database. How many people have done an installation of SharePoint through the GUI using the wizard thing? All right, okay. So you know when you get finished with that, you have a central admin content database with a GUID the size of Texas on there. It's not very user-friendly to use. So I've got an article out on my blog, Brian's blog, on my microtechpoint.com, where it walks you through step by step on how to rename the central admin content database to get rid of that GUID. All right, so where are we? We're in Chicago. So how many people say GUID versus GUID? So GUIDs? All right, GUIDs. All right. More GUIDs here. Okay, always test depending on part of the northeast or the west. I would say the east side of the country uses GUID, and the west side of the country uses GUID more, I would say. So I was curious where we are right in the middle. So I'm a GUID person, so we'll know that. But we can rename our central admin content database if you view that blog. Also, if you've gone through a web application installation and you've accidentally fat-fingered something, or you ended up with the default WSS_config, I have a separate blog article, because they are separate items or steps you need to take to rename that that content database for your web apps. So you can check out that blog article as well. Now, also, excuse me, most Surface applications have at least one database, so we have to be concerned about, and I'm just kind of preparing you why we, helping to understand why it's so important for us to worry about our SQL Server configuration. What I want you to do is convince your DBA, if you haven't done so, to have your own instance of SQL Server. As we go through the session, I'm going to give you situations or configuration options that you want to apply to your instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, versus going up to your DBA, it's like, oh yeah, we've got a flavor out there already. Just go ahead and access that one. You need to convince them to get your own flavor of SQL for SharePoint. So every instance, is that a beer? Who just opened a can of beer? So I just heard. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to ask not to pop open a can while I'm talking, because I automatically think it's a beer. Okay, and I get distracted, and I won't know where I am or anything like that. Okay. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Exchange, right? Is that what we're doing? Oh, no, SQL. It's right there. So we have each instance of SQL Server has 4 different databases. The 2 that I have in block print are the master and MSDB database, and the 2 in the bottom of the TempDB and model database. Those 2 are the ones that have the most impact on the performance of SharePoint. The master database for SQL Server is like the config database for SharePoint. The MSDB database is just a database that stores all of the automated jobs, log shipping information, replication information. So really from a SharePoint's perspective, there's not too much I'm concerned with unless we use the master data. If we lose the master database, then we're in deep doo-doo because now we don't have SQL working. So, but the bottom two, the temporary work storage areas. So if I have a list out there and I've got 10,000 items in it and I decide I want to slice and dice it so it comes out in a different, chronologically instead of by name, or we can do that. But it needs to store that information where in a location to do that slicing and dicing, and it uses the TempDB database to do that. The last one is the template that's used to create all of the databases. So my instance of SQL Server that we're going to dedicated to SharePoint, I'm going to be able to customize that model database, and every new database, whether the DBA creates it or I create it from inside of SharePoint, is going to use that as a snapshot of the new database. That's the one that's going to cause us the most pain if we leave it as it is. But the changes that we're going to make may not necessarily be beneficial for other line of business applications. That's why I want you to get your own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint. Now, the SharePoint farm requires, if you walk through and do a spousal installation, now spousal installation is when you hit setup.exe and you sit there and you say, okay, 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 okay. Very similar to what you do with your spouses. So I call that a spousal installation. If you do that, you're going to end up with 20 different databases. And it's important for us to have that model database already pre-configured. So as I'm with our optimization settings, so as I'm creating these new databases, we know for sure that we're going to use these new configuration settings. The content database can contain several site collections. That number is increased. I'm going to save that for the slide that we'll talk about 2016. A site collection can only reside in one content database still. Use full recovery model on production databases. On production databases, this is my big concern. So that ginormous transaction log that we are going to talk about in a little bit. Often, if you search, well, my database, my transaction log is huge, my SharePoint content database, people will tell you to put in simple recovery model. So I'm going to convince you not to do that because I'm going to show you why you're not to do that. But I'm also going to show you how to prevent that ginormous transaction log. So a full recovery model will only work if you're in the full recovery model is necessary in order for us to be able to avoid ginormous transaction logs and, more importantly, be able to do data recovery. So one of the things right now with Microsoft, the soft recommendation for a database in SharePoint 2010 and 2013 was to be at 200 gigabytes. Now, we can work with our DBA. The DBA can go out there and say, I'm going to put a maximum size of 200 gigabytes on that database. Or we can actually control it from inside of SharePoint by using a couple configuration settings. One of them being the site collection quota template that's applicable at the web application level. And the other is by controlling the number of site collections that you allow inside of the database. So we can control that size without asking our DBA to do so. Now, how many people are both the DBA and the SharePoint admins? We have a few of those, I'm sure, okay? How many people that are in the SharePoint world actually know and talk to their DBA fairly regularly? All right, very good. I have a rule. One of the things I suggest, and the DBAs love me for this, is to take your DBA to lunch once a month. Find out what's going on. Dig into their personal life. Get to know them really well. And the reason I say dig into their personal life is because maybe over July 4th weekend, you're thinking about upgrading from SharePoint 2010 to 2013, and as you're having a second shot of tequila with him, you find out that he's going to be out of town that entire weekend. Well, do you really want to do a full upgrade of a version of SharePoint if your senior DBA is going to be out of town that weekend? Probably not, so you may want to work around and find out when there would be a better time for you to perform that upgrade. So with that said, let's talk about how we can control our sizes of databases so we don't have to buy our DBA's lunch so often or shots of tequila, whatever they may like. So we have a web application, and each web application could have one or multiple databases. By default, it gets one database. And our soft limit, as we talked about, is 200 gigabytes with SharePoint 2010 and 2013. So we want to control that from inside of SharePoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to control the site collections that go in there. We can use a PowerShell command, say I want to create this new site collection, and I want to force it in database number 3, we'll say. Or we can actually go in and configure database 1, 2, and 4 to not allow any new site collections. So we can control the location of our site collections. We can actually group or categorize the site collections that are being populated in a database, and then we can use that PowerShell command or the SharePoint configuration, or I'm sorry, the SQL configuration for adding those site collections. So let's say we just came out of our 37th meeting, and we've discovered that we're going to need 800 site collections over the next year. And the size of those site collections are going to be 500 megabytes. So if we decide that, how many databases will I need to support those 800 site collections and stay within the 200 gigabyte limit? One. Okay. Anybody else have another number? Two. I like two. Give that. I got my Vanna White here, so she'll be handing out earbuds or something like that. So two. If you do the basic math, and that's what I have, 400 times 500 megabytes is 200 gigabyte database. I need 800 site collections, so I just need 2 databases. All right. This is for 60 days of training at Microsoft and CBT Nuggets, sorry. What is wrong with this calculation? How many site collections, or what's the actual size of each site collection? I said it's going to be 500 megabytes, but there's a web app setting that we have that actually makes that statement untrue when it comes to creating them. Yes, sir. Second stage recycle bin, by default, is 50% more. So every one of those site collections is actually 750 megabytes. Training for that gentleman back there. So that's exactly right. So now instead of having just 2 databases, I actually need 4 databases to hold those site collections. And I did some math because I didn't want to try to do this on a Friday after you guys and us being out all week. So really, if we do the math for us, we can put, if we decide to go to 250, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a 500 megabyte site collection quota template. We're going to assume the 50% default for the second stage recycle bin is still turned on, and we're going to set it up so now that we have only 250 site collections are going to be allowed in those content databases. Now I can I'll need 4 databases to hold those 800 site collections. It'll actually be 250, then the second one will be 500, then 750. I'm still short, so I create that 4th database to make sure I can hold my 800. Now, if we do this before we start adding site collections, it uses a round-robin approach. So the very first site collection will go in database number 1. The second one will go database number 2. The third one will go into database number 3. And then the 4th site collection will go into number 4. And then it goes right back around and starts adding 5, 6, 7, and 8 on database 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it tries to keep them and maintain the size of the databases equally if you create these databases in advance. Because every time you add a site collection, it goes out and looks at how many site collections are in each database and find out what has the most room to allow another site collection, and it will store that in there. And you can mess around that inside of Central Admin to force a site collection into a particular database just by increasing the number of site collection it allows. If we have time, we'll go into that. So that's how we control the size of our databases in SQL Server, SQL Server databases in SharePoint 2013. Now, some configuration options that we have to be concerned with at the instance level. Again, we've convinced after several shots of tequila to our DBA that we're going to get our own instance of SQL for SharePoint. And what we need to do is also work with them, because by default, when I create a new database, there's an MDF file and there's an LDF file, and guess where they're stored? On the C drive. And that's not a good thing, because what else is on the C drive? The system, the operating system, the page file. Now, personally, because I like to take vacations, I say put everything on the C drive. That way you don't have to worry about, I think I set this on the D drive, these are over in the L drive. You just put everything on the C drive and just make it huge. Just kidding, don't do that, please. So we're going to look at the default file locations. Every time I create a database, I put the transaction log and the data file on the C drive. The memory settings per instance of SQL Server, they're pretty much memory hogs. You'll see that. So we need to configure the memory settings for each instance of SQL Server to make sure there's not one consuming all the memory, physical memory for that machine. Max degree of parallelism. If you look that up and say, what should I set that to and don't include for SharePoint, so on our line of business application, for instance, another reason that I don't want you using a line of business app, because the line of business app may have a max stop of 4. Because it's about 1 per core, and it's supposed to improve transactions. It's not true for a SQL Server instance. So I want that. It has to be. In fact, you can't even install SharePoint 2013 without setting that max stop to 1 Okay, some people try to set it to 1. It's like, oh, I'm going to trick it. I'm going to go set it to 4. You've just told yourself probably about 35% in performance. So don't mess with that. Leave it at max stop when you're working with an instance of SQL Server for SharePoint. The other thing we want the DBA to do is we want them to create an alias for us, a SQL Server alias in the SQL Server Configuration Manager. Because what this does, right now, let's say I spin up my SharePoint farm, and they said, oh yeah, I've got your instance of SQL Server for SharePoint is on server 1, and I gave it a name called /SharePoint. So you've got all your scripts that are using server 1 /SharePoint. You've got everything inside the SharePoint world pointing to server 1 /SharePoint. Well, next weekend, they decide they're going to roll everything to server 2. It's a much beefier machine. What do you have to do in SharePoint? You have to go and fix everywhere you put server 1 /SharePoint. So what they can do for you is create you an alias. And in that alias, it's going to point to server 1 /SharePoint. And everywhere inside of SharePoint, it asks for the database server name. You're going to use the alias. Now, if they decide to change that from server 1 to server 2, it's not going to matter to you because they're going to spin up our image, our database or instance for SQL for SharePoint on server 2. They're going to redirect that alias to server 2, and I don't need to go back and change anything at all. So make sure you stay with them and work with them on aliases. Now, if you're using SharePoint 2010 and you have the fast search, remember that was a separate SKU. If you're doing that, then that SQL alias is not using that. That would require a DNS alias. So there's just a couple people that have asked me about that, so I threw that in here. Something else that's unique with SQL Server for SharePoint, it uses a unique collation. It uses Latin 1, case insensitive, accent sensitive, comma sensitive, and width sensitive. The default instance of SQL Server, if we did a spousal installation for SQL Server, is not that one. So if my DBA goes out and creates a database for me and says, Brian, okay, I've got this database, I called it Ignite Friday, and I try to connect to it, and he used the default instance of the collation, well, I'm going to get a collation error from inside of SharePoint. So what we do is we ask them to install SQL Server, or if we don't get our own instance, well, first off, we convince them to get our own instance, and then during the installation, they're going to set it to this Latin 1 General CIASKSWS. And we don't have to worry about that as an issue at all. But if they don't do that, when they create a database, they can drop down out of a list of 5,000, it looks like, and they can choose that one. And there's some that are very similar. I've had one DBA, it took him 4 tries to get to this one, because there's one that's called Latin, there's one with just general in it, so he kind of heard some of the words, but didn't really pay attention to everything we were doing. So I'll show you that when we get into the demo. So we want to make sure, again, that's another reason to have an instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint. Now, at the database level, we have the temp DB, we have the model DB. So the temp DB here, this is going to increase, what we want to do when we go into configuration settings is by default, the size of the model database and the temp DB database are very tiny. So we want to increase those, so we're going to do that when we go in the demo. And we're going to do the same thing that we're going to do with the model database. We would do the temp DB database. Now, this is one database that's in production, that it's okay to be in simple recovery model, and it is by default. Because the temp DB database, remember, it's just that list where it does a slice and dice of information, and every time I restart SQL Server, it just flushes it out. So I don't need to back that up. You can actually set that one in simple recovery. If you should happen to discover that the transaction log for your temp DB database is huge, someone took that out of full recovery and put it in a simple. Took it out of simple, put it in full recovery. So we can put that one back in simple recovery. And we're going to look at these settings when we go inside the configuration demo. The other thing we want to do is take advantage of always on for SQL Server 2016, or excuse me, for SQL Server 2012. That was introduced then. It's also available in SQL Server 2014. And there's really 4 parts to configuring that. I'm just going to give you an overview of those steps. The first one is you need to set up to make sure the SharePoint 2013 has Service Pack 1 on it. You need to create a SQL alias that's going to point to the SQL Server node that's going to host your content. And you need to create the new farm databases in your service app databases pointing to that alias. So really always on requires an alias. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and prepare databases for always on. And what we're going to do is make sure they're in full recovery model, and we're going to back all of those databases up before we go in and switch on always on. The third is we're going to create a SQL Server cluster, which means we're going to create an always on availability group, and they're going to create what's called a listener. And we're going to point which is our step 4, we're going to create our always on cluster with SharePoint by updating the SQL alias now to point to the listener. Again, this is a high level overview. There are step-by-step documentation and MSDN and in TechNet to be able to get you to do all that in more detail. But this is kind of a step-by-step and taking advantage of that. This is going to be really helpful with you in SQL 2012 with SharePoint 2013, better with SQL 2014. I'm going to talk about SQL 2014 specifically. They've improved that in several different areas. So again, another reason we want you to start moving to SQL Server 2014 away from 2012. Just out of curiosity, who's running SQL 2014? Very good. 2012? Most of you still. Anybody still back on 8? A few of you? Okay. All right. So if you're thinking of going from 8, try to skip through 12 and go right to 14 because it'll be beneficial for you specifically with the always-on world and some improvements that they're making with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. Was that a beer? Oh, who's doing that to me? Obviously somebody came in late. So, we all good? Oh, man. Oh, now it's a little party in here, huh? All right, if you're going to do that, let's share them at least, if it is beer. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. And I'm going to go into an image here. All right, so how does it look for you guys? Yeah, as soon as I connected the projector, it went to tiny print mode. So this is an instance of SQL Server. Let's assume that this is going to be my instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint. So we want to look at a couple things here. We're going to go into the instance first, which means we're going to right-click on the top, if I can get there, and we're going to go to Properties. And inside of here, let's start with memory. You're going to see by default this instance of SQL Server gets 2,147,483,647 megabytes of RAM. How many people in this room have that much RAM on one machine? I didn't think so. Okay. This guy says that. Okay. So that's a lot. So what's the problem here? The problem is if I've got 2 instances of SQL Server on the same machine, the first one in to get that, let's say we have 32 gigs of RAM on a SQL Server machine. The first one that gets in and starts consuming that RAM wins. So the line of business apps, the finance department comes in early. They decide they're going to chunk out a bunch of analysis today, and they now have been working for a couple hours, and they've consumed 26 gigs of RAM. Well, I always give 4 to the operating system, which means now I only have 2 gigs left for my SharePoint world. So what we need to do if we're going to share, if we have a server that's hosting multiple instances of SQL Server, is we need to put a cap on this to say this instance of SQL Server cannot take any more than 14 gigs of RAM. All right? So you had 32. So 4 goes to the operating system. 14 now goes to the line of business apps. And the other 14, we would set that same thing for the SQL Server for SharePoint. We would set that with a 14 as well. So that way, there's not one that's going to come in and consume all that memory. Now, this option below, above it is the minimum amount of RAM. And now what this is going to do for me is not going to say, as soon as I spin up this, or start SQL Server, it's not going to say you get 10 gigs of RAM. It's going to say once you reach 10 gigs of RAM by consuming it, then never release below that until I restart the machine. So now it's always going to be in a little window of 10 to 14. Once it gets to 10, it's not going to release it all back, so you don't have to go and call for it again. So that's another option that you could set in here. Now, this image has only got so I'm pushing this. By the way, I have a Surface Pro 3 here with VMware running, Hyperlink running on this, Hyper-V, so I can't even say it. So this has got 8 gigs of RAM. It's got VMware on it, and I got 2 images running. I got a domain controller back there, and I've got the SharePoint SQL Server running. And when I checked before I started, it was about 7.3 gigs of RAM are consumed. That's why it's behaving very well so far. So something else in here, database settings. Remember I said by default, my data file, my log file, and my backup files. I love the fact we're putting the backup files on the C drive. That's just perfect. But those are the default settings that we have to worry about. So what we need to do is talk to our DBA and say, dude, my instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, I really like, I would like a file share out there. And we're going to show, actually I did a session on Tuesday, we can actually back up content from our servers in-house to Azure now. So there's a backup, Azure backup utility. So one of my demos I did on Tuesday was how to do that, it could be a file share, it could be your SQL Server databases, so we can back it up to Azure as an option for our backups. And we can point to it using a UNC name or a URL, I'll hold off the URL piece for now. So we would come in here and change this to something. Now, I only have a C drive in here, so I think I have a SQL logs. I can barely see this, so. And then this one I would change to SQL data. Now pretend that C actually says L, and pretend this C that I'm working with now actually says, I'm doing this the wrong way, aren't I? Pretend this is L here, SQL logs. And let's bring this back to data, actually. And then, now again, this would not make sense, but we could also, the directories have to exist. That's the reason I'm doing it this way. So one of the things we want to do for our instance of SQL Server for SharePoint is decide where do I want my MDF files, the data files, where do I want my LDF files, and where do I want my backup files. And we change them in this instance of SQL Server. So for every new database, it will put my MDF where I tell it to, it'll put my LDF where I tell it to, and it'll put my backups where I tell it to. Now you can override the backups in this settings for central admin, but that's going to be the default settings for it. Now these are for new databases. If I've got databases already out there with all the LDF and the MDFs on the C drive, I need to go and walk through steps and move those to a different directory, to the new directory we created here. Now with that said, if you go to my blog where it's because Brian blogs on renaming a content database, the steps are very similar. You're not going to rename it, you're just going to move it instead. So you're going to copy it to a different location and then you'll reattach it. So it's very similar to that. I wouldn't walk through it step by step as it is. If you have any questions on how to do that, just let me know and I'll walk you through it. I'll help you with that piece. So those are settings at the server level, the instance level that we would need to configure to optimize SQL for SharePoint. Now the other thing we do in the database level is we got those 4 system databases I told you about, and here's our model database. And if I go to properties of that, and then I go to files, you're going to see that every database that I create from here forward, it's going to take a picture of this guy right here. It's going to add the SharePoint tables to it, so the data file is the top one, which is 4. I think that comes out to about 7 or 8. And then the log file comes up to about 3. Okay. So then once we created that database, we go in and we decide we have a 10 megabyte file we want to upload. So what it's going to do is going to look at it, because you're going to see the next option over. Let me slide this out to 10. I didn't restart the machine, so or the instance, so these guys aren't going to reflect here yet. Because it also has a setting that's not good for us. It's helpful, but not good for us, and that's autogrowth. So this is the situation. We've just started up, we just created a new database, and we use the default settings out of the box, and the database is sitting out there, and after adding the system tables required by SharePoint, it has about 3 megabytes of room left. Now I'm trying to upload a 10 megabyte file. So what it's going to do is like, dude, I don't have enough room for this. You'll hear it say that if you listen to your speakers. And it's going to say, but you've got autogrowth turned on. So you're telling me I can autogrow by 1 megabyte at a time. So it's going to stop. So I'm going to upload 10. I only have 3 left. I need 7 more megabytes. 5, 6, 7, all that many. So what it's going to do, it's going to stop. It's going to grow by a megabyte. Okay, dude, I'm out of room again, right? Because I just used that. So it's going to stop again. It's going to grow. It's going to stop again and grow and grow and grow. So it's going to grow 7 times. Back to the 7. It's going to grow 7 times in order for me to accommodate the upload of that file. So what we want to do, the auto growth is more like an insurance policy. We want it there so users can't perform their work. All right, we want to avoid that problem. But what we initially want to do is not even require the auto growth. So what we want to do is kind of figure out what size databases we're going to be using. We're going to come in, we're going to change the size of this model database to that size now, the transaction log to that size now. We'll change the auto growth so they're better sizes. When it does auto growth, it's not going to grow in baby steps of 1 megabyte at a time. We'll have it grow in 75 megabytes at a time. And that way, when I create new databases for SharePoint, these settings will reflect those database settings. So let's go ahead and change that 4 to, we'll say 250. And then the transaction log is usually 25% of that. We're just going to call that 75 for now. And we're going to change our auto growth. So instead of growing at 1 megabyte, we're going to grow at 100 megabytes at a time. I like using megabytes instead of percentage because I know exactly how long it's going to take. So for my transaction log, I'm going to take that to 10 mega. I'm going to change it to megabytes instead of percentage, and I'm going to have that grow by 50, we'll say. And then we're going to go ahead and do an OK, and then we'll do an OK there. So this is going to update the model database. So now every new database that I create is going to pick up these settings. Now let's test that. We're inside, we're a DBA. I'm going to come up, I'm going to go to the right, And we're going to do a new database. And you're going to see 250, 75. Autogrowth, I must have fat fingered it once. Yeah, no, 103, that's good, and then 50. And again, the path hasn't changed. So a lot of people's like, don't you change the path at the model database setting? No, that is a setting at the instance level for that. That's why you have to have your own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, because you might want all your SharePoint data in a completely different world than your line of business apps. Okay, so as a DBA, I've gone out, I've changed the model database inside of SQL Server, I've tested it, and it looks and smells and tastes the way I want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this because I don't really need to create a database. No, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to prove two things. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create the database, I'm going to call this not good. Anybody know why I'm calling it not good? Sorry? Well, it's not good because of that, because, well, if it's not, that's kind of, I've kind of fixed it, but I just haven't restarted SQL Server because I don't have time. So why else is this not good? So I'm the SQL Server DBA. I'm creating a database, and why is it not going to work for SharePoint? Collation. Who said collation? This gentleman right here. How about, what else do we have? We have earbuds, sorry? No, that'd be different though. Here, you just look like you need a hat. Will you give this gentleman over here an earbud thing? Okay, so that's exactly right. So I'm just going to show you that that's not going to work. Let me go in here. And I'm going to go into Central Admin. Well, it's still there. And in Central Admin, oh, by the way, have you guys seen this? View these issues. What's that mean with the pink bar? Doesn't that just irrigate you? What is that telling me right there? Doesn't that annoy you, though? Is it my OCD? Come on, be honest. A little bit, maybe? All right. I thought I'd get more people to confess to it. So look at this. View these issues. You're about having a meeting with your boss. You can click on View these issues to see what they all are. Hopefully it'll go fast enough. And then, look, this is just a list. So how do we fix it? All right, we just go up, we click this guy right here. We go up the list. We go up to, again, I can't see items. Sorry, thank you. Delete. Okay. Central admin. Bam, done. See, we complicate things, right? It's that simple. The bar's gone now. We can go back. Happy hour is all good. We don't need to worry about that. Now, by the time, depending when the timer job runs, hopefully it won't run before I end this session, but all right, so I don't know if I was going, content databases. So we're going to come in here and manage content databases. We're going to add a new content database. Make sure you have the right web app. And I'm going to use that I'm going to say it's MTP01. I'm going to use that not good that my DBA created for me. I can do this, I promise. And here's my max site collection. Remember I said after we did that other slide, we're going to put this at 250 max? No, I'm sorry, that's the warning, 200. And then 250 is the max. That's how we're going to do this along with a site collection quota template, and that's how we're going to control the size of our databases. We're going to do an okay. It's going to come up in a second and say, dude, can't use it. Collation is wrong. Okay? So that's why we have our own instance of SQL Server already dedicated to SharePoint, and that collation's been set because it is a SharePoint instance of SQL. We won't have to worry about this as an issue. So that's why that one's not good. Now we're going to go inside. Let me just go back here. We're going to go back in. I'm going to show you something else that's not good. We're going to go and add a content database. We obviously can't use the one they created for us. So we're going to create one here. I'm just going to call this one better. And by the way, whenever you create a database, put the _DB on it. You get better performance. You don't, but I think you do. Because the system doesn't have to, is this a database? Is this a table? Is this, yeah, so I always put _DB on it. All right, so we're going to call this better DB. And we're going to set this at 200 and 250, 250. And we're going to go ahead and, is this going to work okay? It's going to create it. But I'm going to tell you why it's better, but still not great when it gets over to Squeal here. So let's jump back over to Squeal. And I'm going to right-click databases and do a refresh. And here's my better DB. I'm going to right-click on that and do properties. And we're going to go to files. And what's wrong with that picture? Auto growth is not, yeah, it does not pick up. So every time you create a database, This is why you need to get comfortable with your DBA. Every time you create a database, like, dude, created 5 new databases today. Can you fix the autogrowth setting for me? All right? So, or you obviously can script all this with PowerShell, but I'm just assuming if we're just doing it through the GUI, this is what we'd have. And what happens is actually a script coming over from SharePoint to SQL that's overriding that autogrowth setting from the model, unfortunately. Okay, so be aware of that as well. What else do we want to do in here? So model database, better DB. We've been inside of here. Okay, that's okay. I think that's all good for now. If there's something else, I think I'll come back to it. All right, let's go back out the slides. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're good. Come on, give me it back. Here we go. Does anybody have a SQL Server SharePoint situation that was good or bad that you want to share? Like maybe, oh man, I did this, and after I did that, I wasn't able to use my database. Like it's something you learn trial by error or something like that. Anybody have something you want to share with the audience? Yes, sir.
When we went to SQL 2014, our user profile services stopped working as of like.
The what stopped working?
SQL user profile.
So when they upgraded to SQL 2014, their user profile services stopped working, so they had to go to apply a CU. Do you remember what CU applied? Oh. April 2014 CU. Will you give him you want some training for Microsoft at CBT Nuggets, or do you want earbuds?
I can give it to my team. Training is good.
Training. Thank you very much. All right, cool. So let's go back into our slides here. Thanks, Vanna. Okay, so a couple other things. Let's talk about SQL Server 2014 for SharePoint 2013. What's the big deal? So what we want to do, and now we already know of a heads up that we need to be concerned with. If you upgrade to SQL 2014 from SQL 2012, first off, if you're using Standard Edition, you get support for 128 gigs of RAM versus only 64. So that's double the amount of RAM that we can use. Secondly, I told you there were some always-on enhancements. These are a few of them right here. Supports 8 secondary replicas as opposed to 4. Read-only secondaries are still available even if I lose my primary, which was an issue when you were using SQL Server 2012. And your Azure environment, I talked about the backup availability or Azure backup for SharePoint. The group data files, the entire replica is backed up, and you can back up to our URL to store in the Azure environment. So there's several enhancements just to the always-on functionality that you'll want to take advantage of or be able to take advantage of if you're using SQL Server 2014 versus 2012. Security, by default, the backup is encrypted. You don't have to worry about that. We can't do that with SQL 2012. So that's a couple items there. In addition, SQL Server 2014 with SharePoint 2013, you must have the May cumulative update because the access services won't work with it unless you do. So on the May CU is what you'll require for 2014. And any new deployments, you should specify the availability group listener for your host, for your central admin database, and your config database in order for them to take advantage of that. So there's a few extra steps there. App Fabric 1.1 installation is used for that. If you're unsure, or you're trying to convince your DBA to go to 2014 versus 2012, you'll have access to these videos, by the way, on Channel 9. They've been doing them within 24 hours. So if you're like, tomorrow's like, man, I really miss Brian, you can pop my session up on Tuesday or from today, and you can hear my voice again, okay? So don't be upset when you hear it today. Okay, now, but seriously, this link will work in there, and you'll be able to go out. It does a comparison of the different versions of SharePoint, of SQL, excuse me, and you'll see that's why you want to go to 2014. Yes, sir. 14. It's the CU 2013. I'm sorry. Service Pack 1 for SQL Server 2014. Yeah, so because CUs are Service Pack is just accumulation of CUs. So if Service Pack 1 is out, you can apply that instead of just doing the CU. Now, you guys remember in the old days when the CU they weren't? What's cumulative? You mean it includes everything, right, from previous? Remember like 2 years ago, it wasn't that? If you were trying to patch a farm, or roll out another firmware, you'd install SharePoint. You'd install SharePoint Service Pack 1, and then cumulative packs. So CU April, CU August, CU September. They weren't cumulative. I don't know what they were. I think it was cumulative of hot fixes, but not cumulative of previous CUs. But they fixed that. It's all beauteous. Okay, so this link here in the bottom will get you access to a chart that shows you the functionality in those flavors of SQL Server. The bigger thing about why I want you to go to 2014, SharePoint 2016 is going to require it. So for those of you that raise your hand about going to 2008, well, I think we're just going to go to 2012. Well, if you think about going to SharePoint 2016, now you've got another whole step to go through. Let's get yourself from 2008 to 2014. That'll prep you for SharePoint 2016. Okay, so make sure you do that. I'll make sure there's no hands over there. So that's a big deal. That's why I got that. I tried to get it to blink, but it wouldn't blink. All right, some other stuff. I just found this slide. Isn't that cool? All right, so I borrowed this from Mr. Bear's session this week. So why am I concerned about SQL Server environments? Content databases. What's the soft limit I said we should be using? 200? We're going to be at a terabyte now. Okay? 100,000 site collections per content database will be something now. Now these are not in concrete at this point. These are proposed limits for down the road. I think this far along will be okay. The list threshold, that list threshold of 5,000 will be increased. No number given yet. The max file size. What's the max file size I can upload into SharePoint right now? 2 gig. We're finally getting 10 gigs now. Okay. Again, all the more reason we need to be concerned about SharePoint 2014 or SQL 2014. There's some file name character restrictions that we have in 2013. They're going to go away. I don't know what the list is. My guess is they're still working on that. And they're going to 2 times the number of items we can store in a search index with SharePoint 2016. So if you didn't catch Bear's session, if you've seen this, okay, I apologize. But if you haven't, this is why it's important for us to get to SQL 2014, because it's going to help us prepare for 2016. And we're going to be able to take it, as you can see, everything's being increased. So we're going to need more storage. Database is one of the things that'll never go away. I used to only do SQL. Then finally someone said, you should get into SharePoint. Well, that's consumed my life for the last 8 years, but I still kind of dabble in the SQL world. But it's just something for you to be aware of with SharePoint 2016, and you'll want to be ready for it by having at least SQL 2014, and this is going to be helpful with that, or that will be helpful with this. Okay, let's talk about ginormous transaction logs. So 385 megabyte MDF file, and I've seen it was a 12 gigabyte LDF file attached to it. Anybody seen worse? That's about 10.5 gigs. Anybody have a system stop working because their transaction log filled up? Exactly, quite a few. I was actually teaching a 5-day class, admin class, to a private company. So I was on site, and they actually had their SharePoint environment shut down because of that fact. So what do we do? Why does that happen? What do you guys think? Why does it happen? Why does the transaction log get so large? Lots of transactions. Sorry. Search queries. 2 verbose. You have verbose. That's more verbose logging. So all good reasons. One of the things that happens is so the process, I go into a list or a library and I decide to add some items, or I decide to update some items. Let's say I'm going to update 50. Now it's just a game now, isn't it? I'm surprised you guys didn't all go down like, okay, 1, 2, 3, pop. All right, so we decide we want to modify some content in SharePoint. Now I'm thirsty for a beer. And so we send the request to SharePoint, which obviously goes to SQL Server. SQL Server, the background is like, let's check to see if this is inside what's called the buffer cache. If those rows aren't already inside the buffer cache. So we talked about the RAM for SQL Server. We're going to give 14 gigs of RAM. We talked about the example before. Part of that RAM is allocated to what's called buffer cache or data cache. And what it does is when I bring content in from SQL, it kind of hangs out there as long as it can until something comes in, it runs out of RAM, or that buffer cache, data cache, and then it flushes it out somewhere else. So if it's already in the buffer cache, it's going to be a much faster response already. But if it's not, it's going to go out to Squeal. It's going to pull that content into that buffer cache. And then it's going to write it to that LDF file. And then roughly 60 seconds later, there's a process called checkpoint that comes along, and it looks at the LDF file and says, okay, what's in this LDF file that wasn't there a minute ago, 60 seconds ago? And it takes those transactions and it then writes it to the MDF file. So that's the process that takes place when we're working with content inside of SharePoint. This is more the SQL level of what's happening back there. So how we get large transaction logs is this. If you read Microsoft's explanation of what a full backup does, if you go out and say, okay, what's a SQL Server full backup? It says it backs up the MDF file and the transaction log file. Part of that is, well, that statement is correct, but it's incorrect at the same time. Because what happens is, let's say I start a backup of a SQL Server database at 5 p.m., and it takes 4 hours for that backup. At 5 p.m. when I start that backup, it goes into the LDF file, puts a little tick mark starting at 5 p.m. And then it runs through the backup of that data file, the MDF file, and then when that data file ends, so the backup of that data file ends, it then goes out, puts another tick mark in the LDF file, so end of data file backup. And then it wraps back around into the transaction log file. It looks at that start tick mark and that end tick mark, and it grabs all the transactions that occurred in those 4 hours, and it writes them to that backup file. So it's not completely inaccurate that in the fact that it backs up the transaction log. It backs up the transactions that occurred during the backup is a little more accurate way to say that. So the problem with the ginormous transaction log is we never do an actual backup of the log. So it will grow until it runs out of disk space. Okay? So what we need to do is we need to find a period for us to back up that content, to actually back up the log. Now, if you search online and say, look, I got a large transaction log, my MDF file is small, some people will say, just put it in simple recovery model. Because what's going to be different? When I go back to here a sec, let me go back to this one. When I go back to here, so if I'm in simple recovery model right here, the other way. If I'm in simple, when this LDF writes to the MDF file, this guy gets purged out. So if you do put it in simple recovery model, they're absolutely correct. You will not have a problem with ginormous transaction logs. Okay, that is a possibility. It's not the best possibility, but it is a possibility. The difference between that and full recovery over here, if I'm doing this in full recovery, and this is why I say put databases in full recovery, is because now when this checkpoint process runs down here, it doesn't back these up. So this guy just continues to grow until we run out of disk space. So yeah, is it a problem? Absolutely it's a problem. But there's a solution to it, and simple recovery model is not the solution. And the reason it's not a solution is, if we go through this guy right here, so we've decided after having yet another lunch with our DBA, he does a full backup, or she does a full backup every Sunday night. So every Sunday night they do a full backup of the database. And then on Monday night, any transactions that occurred on Monday, they're going to do what is called a differential backup. I call it a cumulative backup. Because it's only, let's say this was on Monday night, or Sunday night, let's say this was 60 gigs up here. So on Monday night, we had a backup, and it was only changes for Monday, and that was only 4 gigs right here. And then we'll do another one on Tuesday. Now, the reason I call it cumulative/differential is because it's going to take all the transactions from here that were changed, and we'll say there's 3 more gigs here. So now the backup is 7 gigs for Tuesday night. We're going to do the same thing for Wednesday night. We're going to do the same thing every night for the week. Then we'll call this one 2 gigs. So now we have 437. Now the size of this is 9 gigs. Now, why do I want to do that? What's the advantage of doing differential backups like this? Yes, sir. That's exactly right. Our backup strategy should be driven by the minimal amount of downtime. Your SLA says 4 hours. You can only be down 4 hours. Your goal for your backup strategy is to minimize downtime and have a sweet recovery strategy. And by using differential/cumulatives, I don't have to go back up. If I need to do a restore, actually, let's make that happen now. We're going to have a disaster on Thursday at 4 p.m. Okay? We lose the MDF file. Remember I talked about the MDF file should be on a separate drive than the LDF file? This is why. If I lose that drive that has the MDF file, and I'm not in simple recovery model, I'm still golden because my transaction log, I've been doing differential backups, and my log, all my transactions for Thursday are still my transaction log. If I'm in simple recovery model, what's in my transaction log? Zilch, 0, exactly. So that's why I don't want you to use simple recovery model. Okay, so we've got the situation. It's 4 o'clock on a Thursday. Happy hour is just, well, started an hour ago. And we got to recover this database. What am I going to do to recover this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to that transaction log and we're going to back up the transactions that are in that transaction log. Even though I can't get to the MDF file, I can still back up that transaction log. So now I'm getting a picture of all the transactions that came through on Thursday. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start the recovery process. So on Monday, we're going to go to the full recovery, the full backup that we did on Sunday, and we're going to restore that first. Our second restore, as this gentleman says right here, is going to be Wednesday night. I don't have to worry about doing Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. So now I'm only doing 2 restores instead of 4, if I was doing transaction logs. So we're going to restore from Wednesday night, and then we're going to go back under step 1, and we're going to restore the log that contains all the transactions that took place on Thursday. I would have lost all of Thursday's transactions if I went in a simple recovery model like somebody told me on the internet. I know it's on the internet, we're supposed to believe it, but okay. This is the only time you shouldn't believe what's on the internet. Okay, so I hopefully convinced you, A, we need separate files, disk, for our log files and our data files, okay? We don't want to use simple recovery model, and I just explained to you why we don't want to do that. What I haven't done yet is explain how do I avoid the ginormous transaction logs. So when in this scenario is it best for me to perform a backup log statement to purge out the transaction log? That's the missing key. No one does that because the full recovery explanation, a full database backup explanation says that they are going to back up the transaction log. So some people believe that the backup log, a backup log statement has taken place or through the GUI, and then it's getting purged out, which is not the case. So when's the best time for me to say, this is a good time for me to purge out that transaction log? Right after my full backup, exactly. Because right now I've got my production, I've got my backup, and there's really no differences between those two because we just walk through the ideas every time I do a backup. It's monitoring those transactions, and it's also going to back those up for me. So what I could do on Sunday night is right after the full database backup occurs, and this is this easy, right inside a SQL Server, you say on success of step 1, which is the full backup. Step 2 is do a backup log. And you do this statement here for that, and you can dump it out to a temporary file, a directory somewhere, and you throw the with init on it, so that way next Sunday night, it's going to back it up to that same exact file. It's going to clobber, the with init is initialized, it's going to clobber the content that's in there, and just have this week. And you can keep that like week after week after week. All right? If you didn't want to keep it for that long, you could actually have a third step on success is to delete that file from the operating system if you wanted to. But most people just leave it hanging out there just in case they ever need to get back to it. So that's how we avoid ginormous transaction logs without using simple recovery model, so we can use that content in the transaction log to be able to recover content in the event we lose an MDF file. Okay, any questions on that? Anybody run into this and say an alternative to this or another way we found? I love having people share things that they've discovered. Yes, sir.
We just set it up to back up the transaction log and keep them, for a couple of weeks in case somebody wants to go back into a moment in time. Hey, last Tuesday I deleted this file, drawn on the recycle bin. You can go back and get it.
Yeah. So some people just do periodically. So the schedule I showed you for backups was a full backup on Sunday, differentials Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I've seen it where there's transactions at 9, noon, and 3 Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday during the day. So that we have copies of that, and you can keep them for a while. So in case you need to dig back to a specific file. Okay, best practices. We're doing well. I'm going to get you out of here on time. So the first thing, check out my curtains. Isn't that cool? All right, so first, are you convinced you need your own instance of SQL Server? Why do I want my own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint? Ideas, sorry. Collation's one. What else? Sorry? MaxStop. Multiple databases. Memory. So this, sorry? Disks. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to have your own instance so you can perform certain tasks. Remember, we went into the SQL Server instance just for SharePoint to put our SharePoint content in a specific location. We're going to avoid spousal installations not only of SharePoint, but also of SQL Server. All right? Database should not exceed 200 gigabytes for SharePoint 2013. That's going to go to a terabyte with 2016. That sounds good. I don't care what you read online for MaxDOP. Do not change it to anything but 1 for the SharePoint SQL Server instance. And I seriously have seen people, they'll put it to 1, they'll install SharePoint, and then they'll go back and change it to 3 or 4. And they lose performance significantly. Speak to your DBA about creating a SQL alias. So if they want to mess around with stuff behind the scenes, yeah, we want to install, we're going to bring it up to a beefier machine, they're going to love it, but you need to change everything you've done over the last year to make sure you can point to server number 2. We can avoid that by using a SQL alias. Modify both the model and the TempDB database. We went through the model database setting of bringing up that initial size and the auto growth. We need to do that for TempDB as well. And again, that one can be in simple recovery model because that's just trashed every time we restart the server anyways. Indexes are well, do it the other way. Statistics are generated and used by indexes for performance. All right? So what we don't want you to do is don't enable the auto create and auto update. Now, for those of you that are DBAs or are familiar with it, rebuilding indexes is supposed to be good, and updating the statistics, which are what indexes use, don't mess with those. The SQL Server team and the SharePoint team, yeah, that was going to sound bad, work very closely together. So they know what they're doing, and they don't want you messing with the indexes. They don't want you rebuilding indexes. I know it's unusual. You don't want me to ever rebuild a content database index? No, we don't. Because the way they have built those two to integrate with each other, it will actually degrade performance. So we don't want you doing that. Avoid auto shrink in databases. I've seen this too. They have auto growth turned on. They haven't set the database to the size it should be, so it's constantly stopping and growing. Some of them I've seen not even change it from that 1, so it's doing baby steps all day to grow. And then tonight, they'll auto shrink it. And then tomorrow, it baby steps all day and grows. If you have auto growth turned on and it's being used, and you can determine that by monitoring it, don't turn auto shrink on so at night it auto shrinks that. Use the database auto growth sparingly, like I said. That should be more of an insurance policy type thing, but use that sparingly because it does cause fragmentation and over that, which means it'll degrade data entry performance. Spread your data files and transaction log files. I talked to the point where just put your data files on one drive. I mean, if there's RAID 5 or RAID 10, absolutely take advantage of that for sure. Create your multiple TempDB files. So remember I said every database has an MDF file and an LDF file. You can extend a database to have NDF files. You can only have one MDF, only have one that's not true in the LDF. So you can have NDF files. Let's just go there so I don't have to get too deep with this. So what you want to do, if you're doing a lot of analysis or a lot of slicing and dicing of content, you want to put out multiple NDF files, which is really just extending your TempDB file to other drives for better performance. And you can do that using NDFs. If you're one of those people that was half asleep and in a meeting and someone said, so who wants to take this on? So who wants to be our SharePoint admin? And you just are half asleep, yeah, I got this. This SharePoint, how bad can it be? And then you realize, oh crap, I need to know something about SQL. And then you get into SQL, it's like, oh, I haven't done a backup in about 3 months. I need to do something there. There's a database maintenance plan wizard in there that will walk you through, just answer the prompts. What databases do you want backed up? How often do you want backed up? What type of backups do you want? What kind of reports do you want? Do you want to check the integrity of the database, which is like a DBCC check DB? It walks you through step by step on creating a backup environment. When do you want to delete the backups? All the reporting. So it's a worst case, at least walk through that to make sure you have something in place. I already talked to you about not rebuilding indexes. Do defrag the drives that contain your content database files. Defrag those periodically because we're doing a lot, especially if you're doing more of an OLTP environment where you're doing a lot of inserts, updates, and deletes. That'll get defragged, and if you that'll get fragmented, so you'll want to defrag that as often as possible. Perform regular backups of database and especially transaction logs. If you haven't been bitten about the transaction log yet, it's probably going to happen at some point, so now you'll be aware of that. And in fact, I've got an article on my blog that talks about, so let's say you did get bit by this already and you fixed it. In fact, I just did a session in Evolutions in London 2 weeks ago, or a similar session, I should say. And a lady asked me, it's like, well, I ran into the problem exactly what I said. I got it fixed by doing a backup log, but my LDF file is like still 12 gigs. There's a way to just shrink that back down, and I got steps on how to do that on my blog. Okay, so go to Brian's blog on my Microtech Point site. To keep an eye on my SQL Server storage and performance, I mean, part of our job as admins is to monitor stuff to make sure it's running as optimal as possible. So keep an eye on that. You can run what's called a DBCC check DB operation. You should do that once a month, just kind of more for DBAs as well, just to make sure, because it looks and smells and tastes good on the surface, but we want to make sure internally we don't have a bunch of torn pages and stuff inside. And of course, say no to simple recovery model. And don't forget about your backups. So a lot of people, we talk about backups. It's like, yeah, my server is over here and server on this side of the room, and my backup machine is over here on this side of the machine, of the room. Okay, how many sprinkler heads are in this room? A lot. So what happens if somehow there's, something happens and we trip the sprinkler heads in this room? My main server is toast and my backup server is toast. So one of the things you got to look at is the location. Have one that's readily available for quick recovery. But we talked about the idea of Azure backup. Put another one somewhere else. I always talk about we're in the Midwest right now, Tornado Valley. I mean, have one 4 blocks down may not be good enough. All right, get it out of the building. Lots of people, I'm going to get it out of the building. Okay, in case the building catches on fire. Well, if you're in Tornado Valley, I mean, California's supposed to fall in the ocean before you guys should be moving before that happens. East Coast has hurricanes coming up through there. So find a location. Now, if you go to the Azure cloud, they're over in Europe, they're in Asia. I mean, they're all over the world. You can actually choose where you want your backup to be stored. It's your choice. West Europe, North Europe, Asia. There's supposed to be, somebody asked about one the other day. There's one missing. I think it's actually Central Region or Central Region. I don't know where the data centers are. I think you can find out if you search it up. But just choose, make sure you have an on-site backup environment as well as a remote. And remote could be in another country. Yeah, you can set up to Mars. Let's see what else we have. I think that's it. Yeah, that's a review of what we have. Okay. So what do we have? Oh, we got some more hats. Anybody want a hat? Who wants a hat? You want a hat? I'm getting pretty good with this. Ooh, now you're, ooh. All right, coming out. Ooh, too far. All right, coming out. All right, a little bit lighter. There we go. Okay, we got rid of those. What else do we have left? Earbuds. How many pair? 2? 2 earbuds. Ask me a good question. Not stump the speaker, but a good question. Question right here. Why should what? SharePoint has its own paragraph that compares the index based on the fragmentation percentage. Correct. But it's not very sophisticated. Right. So we have our own process, but we've got the index that's much better. Why should we not do it? Because Microsoft told me not to. So the question is, why am I saying not to defrag your indexes or rebuild the indexes? It's been in several sessions and several articles, and I just ask that you look it up and and reinforce what I'm saying. It's just the way those two talk to each other. They got that all taken care of. There's timer jobs that do fixes internally the way they want them done versus the way a normal SQL reindex will do. So we'll give him earbuds for this gentleman right here. Honestly, so the question is, why is Microsoft going up to terabyte databases? It really doesn't sound. It's going to link to the backups that take place, recoveries. They're getting requests. They want bigger databases. I mean, not that you can do a terabyte right now, by the way, and you can call Microsoft, because that's why I said it's a soft limit. If you call Microsoft, you have a 400 gigabyte database. They're not going to say, put you on mute, laugh. This dude's got a 400 gigabyte database. He wants me to help him. They're not going to do that. They'll help you because it's a soft limit. So now they're just bringing it up. So they're saying we will have, and they're doing internal structure changes for better performance with something to shredding and stuff.
That was a question to SharePoint admins over here if they have went over 300 gigs.
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. So I've seen huge. Yes. So the session I did, check out my session I did on Tuesday about using SharePoint, using Azure for your on-prem SharePoint disaster recovery. And walk through that. If you have any questions, let me know. Yes, sir. I'm not sure the question. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So there was some rumor a while back that the upgrade from SharePoint 2010 to 2016 was going to be one stop or no stop, non-stop flight, but it's not. It unfortunately did not work out that way. It'll be a two-step deal. Yeah, I just found out about that this week. 2013 will be database attached and a site collection upgrade like we did from 10 to 13. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. Again, it's something that's why they're going to require SQL 2014. So it's those two teams just figure all that stuff out. I don't know the why sometimes, but they just say this is the way it's going to be. I'm going to give a book away. How am I going to do that? Somebody's got a good story on again that we could share with who's left. Anybody got a good story? A good story about?
I've got a good story.
Let's hear it.
Okay. I have a customer and they have a search application, and the problem is each night they are going to do a full crawl, and the link store fee is so huge because they have lots of queries in their farm basically, and we have lots of big tables in there. So each time we do a full crawl, we get a transaction log of 27 gigs, and also like the free space, like the link store DB is 40 gig, and in addition to that we get like a free space, unused space of 27 gigs each night.
Each night. You're doing a backup log statement somewhere tonight, I hope?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, of course, it's not decreasing anymore, but
Right. Okay.
so it's a big issue with the service application we have right now.
All right, cool. Remember that, and then I'll come on up. I'll sign the book for you. All right, folks. You got my email address. You got my Twitter handle. Keep in touch with me. Hope you had a great week. Safe travels. I know you guys are mostly in Bolton. Thank you.